Hi. Who here is actually working on a developer portal, or has a developer portal? So you pretty much know, because sometimes people don't even know really what a developer portal is. And my objective today is mostly to kind of expand your thinking, or to kind of set a higher standard for developer portals, because I've got a feeling from what I've seen out there on the web, a lot of portals really set their expectations very low. So this presentation will be about a few frameworks to think about developer portals, and then some things to keep in mind when you set your expectations for a future portal. But thank you, Mehdi, for the introduction. So I'm Kristof and Tomme. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pronovix. We're a 30 people strong consultancy that specializes in Drupal developer portals. So we do the way that I was thinking about how to explain this. Where standard developer portals ends, that's where we start. So we extend developer portals to do complex things like access permission and things like that. So then I only have 20 minutes, so I'll try to condense everything, and I can't talk about all the things. But what I try to focus on is a few of these frameworks that make you think maybe a bit different about portals. So then I'd like to start with why are developer portals important. I think this is obvious, right? Adoption. Without a developer portal, people will not be able to use your API, and you won't have as much people using your API, and your project won't be successful. Also, support costs. If you don't have good documentation, support cost goes up. This is obvious. This is less obvious. I think that developer portals are kind of like a trust signal. The same reason why banks have these really fancy buildings, because it makes people believe that something is trustworthy. They come in and it's like, this is amazing. They've spent a lot of money building this. It must be good, right? And I think that developer portals are your facade for your API. Because your API needs to be minimalistic. You don't want fancy coding in your API. It needs to be functional and direct. I think your developer portal can set a signal and say we've really thought this through, and we've really worked on making this as good as we can make it. So you can trust us. Also, we're not going to go away, because this is one of the biggest issues with APIs, is that they can just be gone in a few weeks or months. And maybe you make a big investment in incorporating an API into your product, and then 2 months later, you no longer can use it anymore. So and giving this kind of signal is, I think, very important. So another thing to think about is who's going to be using your API. First thing, APIs are products, or they should be. You should not run an API program as a project. What I mean, the difference is there needs to be longevity to your API, because if your API is going to be gone in a short period of time, then there was no point in building an API, because it's about connection and about persistent connection and making it easy to have that connection to your software. So it needs to be run as a product. That also means that next to the developers that built the API, you're also going to have a product owner. You'll also have sales, and you'll have marketing. And I think this is something that we often don't always acknowledge, because developers don't really like being sold to, and they don't really like sleazy marketing and stuff like that. But I think that there's ways of doing that in a developer-friendly way. And these people, developer evangelists, that's their job. It's like navigating and balancing between these three branches of the business. Does everybody know what is a developer evangelist? Have you heard of that? Developer evangelist? Okay. You should go check this out. There's a whole community of people that specialize in doing marketing, sales, and onboarding and helping developers get started with APIs in a developer-friendly way. And they're kind of navigating this careful balance between the three of these stakeholders. But I think that there's a last stakeholder that I want to add to the mix is support. It's like support for your product, for your API. And I think that documentarians, the people that write your documentation, are also really important for having a solid product. When I was making these slides, I started thinking that maybe you could actually even have a sort of API maturity program or a maturity pattern that you could derive from this. Like, how many people are involved in your project? Is it just a single developer, or do you have like a team behind your API? Do you have developer evangelists? Do you have documentarians? So in short, I think there's these 6 plus then the customer that are stakeholders of developer portals. And this will drive the design of your portal, because if you have a developer evangelist who needs to do evangelism through your portal, they'll need to be able to post events and do things on the site that help promote the activities that they're doing. The same thing with documentarians. They might drive the design of your continuous integration for your software. But also sales and marketing. You also need landing pages and things that can help you improve the SEO of your site. Most developer portals today are like, well, I'll come to that in a moment. I was almost going to give it away. Because I think that the best way to look at this is to think from the customer's journey, like your developer's journey. And I think that we should be aiming for a kind of like a viral loop in the journey. What I mean with that is that we go from discovery to evaluation, getting started, troubleshooting, and then celebrating. And I'll come to that in a moment. The problem with most developer portals is that they focus on troubleshooting, because that's the stage where developers are at. Like the person who's building the API, they want good reference docs, because that's the thing that they use the most. Because they're trying to troubleshoot and figure out what's wrong, or how to implement a very specific function. The problem is that these are advanced users. They're not the users, like they're not the developers when they get started with your portal. So I think that for the discovery process, you need landing pages. You need pages that look pretty good, that can maybe even help like a business person to decide if they want to integrate with an API, and then go to their developers to get the integration done. For the evaluation, this is the backend monster that I stole from APIdays. For the evaluation, you need to try to reduce the barriers to your API. And this step is actually where developer experience is really kind of defined. How hard is it for a developer to get started? If you have a hackathon, can people get started, like request an account and be able to develop something by the end of the weekend? Or do they have to wait weeks or months until they get authentication to use your API? If you can't give authentication to your actual API, maybe you can give them a mock API so that people can start playing with it like immediately and not be held up by some artificial barriers. So it's very important, because else they'll just go somewhere else and use another API. Getting started, tutorials are really important, but you need to be careful, because often tutorials are written from, look at all these features that we have. And they walk you through the whole thing. And sometimes developers will want just like a part of the tutorial just for doing one very specific thing. So you need to kind of balance both in your portal. Troubleshooting, this is a really interesting research that's not published yet, by Michael Meng, who talked about it at a Write a Docs event in Prague a few weeks ago. He found that when looking at developer behavior and what documentation they were using for learning about an API, that conceptual documentation is actually very important, even though that developers will not say that they want conceptual documentation. Conceptual documentation is kind of like a dictionary, like domain language, explaining what is a certain term. For example, dunning in payment APIs. I didn't know what was dunning until I started looking at like, what is this word? And when a new developer starts doing a first implementation, they might not know all the industry terms that you're using in your API. So you might want to explain those. But what the key finding from that research was that you might want to put it actually amongst your reference documentation, so that you have a kind of a mix between conceptual and reference documentation, which is weird and not really how we're used to thinking about it. Like normally we try to separate these different types of documentation, but it's something that we'll be doing research about together with Michael Meng to see like if we can repeat those results, because it's very, very interesting and important. Because if you don't have the conceptual documentation, a new developer will take a lot more time to understand and really get up to speed. And then last, and I think this is also something that's not always done, is to celebrate, give the developers a place to submit their projects so that they can then refer to that and talk about it to their friends. So that you get this viral loop where developers talk about how awesome their work is that they've done, and then get visibility for that, and you get visibility for your API. Another aspect that I think is interesting to think about is the types of architecture. Because, a developer portal sounds as if it's fairly homogeneous, but actually what we've seen in our work with APIdays is that that's not the case. Actually, there's different types of portals. The most common type is the public API, which is like just a public site that's accessible for whoever can visit the site, and there's no barriers inside of that site. This works well maybe behind a firewall if you have an API that's internal, or just public on the internet if you just want to promote it and get as much adoption as possible. Another type of APIs that we've seen, or developer portals that we've seen, are catalog developer portals. And this was in large multinational that had like hundreds of APIs throughout the organization, like lots and lots of teams all building their own APIs, where they wanted to have, because the whole purpose of APIs is to interconnect and to make it possible to use each other's APIs, to make it possible to find the APIs that are there. And they needed a system where they could submit a new endpoint and the documentation for that endpoint, and can do some quality control to see if the documentation is good enough, and then it could actually get published. And it was really interesting to see as a very different way of doing things, or different type of developer portal. Third type that I distinguished that we saw was partner APIs, I call it, and it's often companies will have partnerships that give access to very specific types of API. So maybe not all your APIs are available to all your partners. Like LinkedIn is a very good example of this. They have some APIs that are only for very specific partners, and then other APIs that are more public. I think it was LinkedIn. But basically where your API becomes like a partner strategy tool. And then you might not want to tell all the other partners that you have a certain API and what is all possible with that API, because maybe they'll get jealous and say like, hey, but we're also a partner, why don't we have access to that? So you might want to have differentiate control to differentiate your access rights to your documentation also. And to be able to do that, that can be fairly complicated because you have different groups of people that have different access. And the last one is utility APIs, where you need a dashboard to see how much they've used of your API and how much they can still use. The last part of my presentation is about technology choice. Now, it's actually surprising how much choice there is, because it's kind of a zoo out there. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Most people start thinking about this when they start talking about technology choices. Just like the format for your REST API, for specification, will you use OpenAPI or Swagger or RAML or API Blueprint? Those are kind of the three big ones today. That's just one part, because this is only your reference documentation. Like if you import that into your portal, you're going to use that for your reference documentation. But that's just, as I said earlier, that's just step 4. That's for people that already know what your API is about. Other documentation probably will be submitted in a different way. And here it gets kind of weird and difficult. It's like, will you use Markdown? Will you use restructured text, which is a format that's used a lot in the Python community? DITA, an XML standard that's used in multinationals that have like reusable chunks of content. Or will you just put it in a WYSIWYG editor in HTML and just, you know, have people type it in the CMS? And like deciding between these things, I've seen over and over again that it's kind of difficult to decide. And there's reasons for all the different different formats, and I can do another presentation just as long about this choice. But it's still something you should be thinking about. And then the last one is portal technology. And I think there's like 3 main choices there. It's like, will you use a static site generator? And like there's a whole lot of them, like a whole lot of them. Or will you use a SaaS, like software as a service, or will you use a CMS? And then here, I think this was one of the things that I wanted to give to you is a word of caution, because most developers, if you leave this to developers to choose, they'll probably go for static site generators because that's what they really like. They like tinkering with. But you have to wonder, you have to think about it like, what is it that I want my team to be doing? Do I want them to be working on improving your portal and spending a lot of time on that? Or do I want them to be working on the API? And like, it's kind of risky because it's a route. It's very easy to say like, well, it's just a website. It's easy to put that up. But once you start going into the complexities and you get different feature requests and you know all the access permission stuff that I talked about earlier, you're probably better off with a CMS where a lot of those functionalities are already built inside of it, and you don't have to start playing with a custom microservice backend that's going to do all of these things. And you know they can do it. It's just that's not their primary job. And unless you're a company that's focused on APIs and you can have like a team working just on your portal, that's probably not a good idea. Like this is Tom Johnson. He's from I'd Rather Be Writing. It's a very famous blog in the technical writing community. He was asking about tool chains that would allow him to be writing rather than tooling the documentation. Yeah, I think this was something that I struggled a lot with for a while because you know we're a Drupal company, so we're a CMS company, and all the developers are like excited about static sites, like because they're better performant and it's more fun to build them and so on and so on. They can't be hacked because you know it's just HTML, and so I had to think a lot to come to this conclusion. Yeah, that's true for very simple sites, but when you have complex sites, you know, you really quickly bump into the limitations of these systems. And you can build everything, but it takes time. And then it's better to have a community of people that are maintaining the software together with you. So we work a lot with Apigee, as I said earlier. So we've been working, which was interesting was that their developer portal was already in Drupal. So we've been doing a lot of extensions of their existing Drupal portals. And yeah, you know, I'm a Drupal guy. So there's a whole ecosystem of contributed codes to extend portals that make it possible to do really crazy things. Like the last thing that I want to do is kind of give like a last call to action, which is if you want to learn more about the research that we're doing, because we're doing some comparative research between portals about blog posts like the maturity model I talked about earlier, or about like get recordings from presentations, or learn more about the open source product that we're building for developer portals. So like what I imagine is that we could as an industry build an open source CMS built on Drupal. I guess that's the thing. you know, we do, but that could become like a platform on top of which we could then build connectors to different vendors. Like we could make an ecosystem that's better connected, that makes it easier to do these really high-end, the complex things in a community way, in an open source way. I heard that there are some proprietary vendors that are trying to do this, but I think that there's probably space enough for an open source application. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, sign up. And the last thing I want to say is that if you're interested in this kind of discussion and you would like to have a further discussion together with some of the people from the local Write to Docs community, there'll be a meetup on Wednesday, 7 p.m., but just go to the address and you'll find out. Yeah, just one last recap. Developer portals are trust signals. It's very important. You should be thinking about all your stakeholders, so evaluate that. Who are your stakeholders? The developer's journey is not only about troubleshooting, it's a lot more than that. There's these 4 types, there might be more, but all of them have like different architectures, and there's a lot of options when building portals. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for the great presentation. I really like those 5 steps where you discover, evaluate, try.
Yeah.
I have a question on how would you engage your developers? Do you have any way of thinking on discovery forums that you would embed?
It really depends. Good question. Like, well, you mean like finding new developers or like increasing the engagement with developers?
I would say increasing the engagement with the existing developers.
I think that the celebration probably helps with that. Like if you give them a way to show off with what they've done. And I think that if you don't have a developer evangelist yet, that's kind of like their job. Like if your team is big enough, then that's probably a good idea to look at that. There's going to be a conference here, DevRelCon, here in London in a few weeks.
7th of December.
Yeah, or it's a bit longer, 7th of December. I think that's a good place to go and look to just see what other people are doing, because that's basically the whole thing that they do. Travel around the world, getting developers excited. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. It's good. Thank you, Kristof. Thank you.
Thank you.